Hello, I'm Zeinab Badawi. Welcome to the Concert Hall in Stockholm, where the Nobel Prize winners received their awards from the King of Sweden for their outstanding contributions to science, literature and economics. This is the first time that this year's laureates are appearing together on television, and they've been joined by their family and friends who've travelled to Stockholm to share in the celebrations. And we are also joined by students from here in Sweden who are going to be putting their questions to our laureates. On this year's Nobel Minds, we have discoveries on repairing damaged DNA, which increase our knowledge of the universe, cure tropical diseases, and in economics, we throw light on the links between poverty, consumption, and welfare, and the Literature Prize gives voice to the voiceless in authoritarian societies. Laureates, congratulations to you all. Wonderful. Let's go straight away to our first question from our audience here, and it is Martin. Martin, please, your first question to our laureates.
So, there are a lot of prizes and competitions in all of your fields, and I just wanted to have your opinion. Do you think it is a good addition to motivate people to get engaged, or do you think it inspires unnecessary competition?
So, Angus Deaton.
Well, economists are never competitive. We have something called perfect competition, which economists believe in. I'm not sure the Nobel does much of that. I've been very impressed by how much positive, just general happiness and well-being it seems to generate. It's clear, though, over the years in the past, there certainly is some resentment on behalf of people who don't win Nobel Prizes.
Have you had any of that?
I've never felt it personally, but you hear discussions.
Blank stares when you pass by?
No, I have not experienced any of that. I've been very fortunate that way. But I do think in the past people have felt that a whole area, you know, that should have been recognized never was recognized, for instance. And I'm sure, and that's a more legitimate feeling than I'm sure there are some people who feel that they should have been recognized and were not.
What a generous man you are, Professor Deaton, in saying that, but I'm sure you deserved your prize. But let me just see what, anybody else? Paul Modrich, Professor Modrich?
Well, I think it's useful in bringing visibility to science and fields. I agree with Angus. I think that there have been instances where people have felt, certainly in my field, that certain areas that were worthy of a prize were neglected. And so there is a value judgment, I think, in selection of the fields.
Professor Campbell?
I think, A, it does not create competition. Scientists don't compete for that. And secondly, I think it's inevitable, and it also adds a nice little bit of something special that scientists can enjoy. So I think it's sort of inspirational and not confrontational, and certainly not inducive of competition.
In the chemistry field, we've been very fortunate in that the three winners worked on different mechanisms of DNA repair, and we had no competition, so we've been fortunate to have it that way. And so in this particular case, there was no competition.
Okay, round off the chemist there, Professor Thomas Lindell.
Yes, I think healthy competition is a good thing. It's excellent if a scientist goes a little bit astray with his ideas, that somebody else corrects them. And I think it would be too comfortable if there was no competition at all, huh?
Okay. Svetlana Alexievich, obviously you are the literature laureate. I should say, actually, of course, everybody, that Svetlana Alexievich is speaking in Russian. And I know the question was specifically about science, but in terms of receiving the Nobel Prize, as Professor Deaton said, it's a real accolade. I mean, do you feel that it's going to help you in some way do what you do better?
Я хочу сказать, что я не думаю, что я буду делать лучше. Я буду делать то, что я всегда делала. И, может быть, повышается какое-то чувство ответственности. Но сказать, что премия что-то с нами особенное делает, навряд ли. Это радость. Но ты делаешь свое дело и делаешь в меру своих сил. Даже если меня не наградили Нобелевской премией, я все равно бы это делала.
The physicists, Professor Art MacDonald, and then... Oh, you want to go first,
Yeah,
Professor Kajita?
Yes. Okay, well, we both wanted to understand what is the properties of neutrinos. And we have the same goal, and coming from different experiments, and we are very much complementary rather than competitive.
Ah, complementary rather than competition. So I'm getting the sense here that, Martin, your question about it perhaps encouraging competition is not getting much traction here. Art MacDonald.
I think the scientists are primarily motivated by the science. They're attempting to understand our universe more completely. I think they're quite satisfied when they recognize themselves that they have made a breakthrough and have understood things more completely. I think when there is the recognition like this by such a respected body as the people who define the Nobel Prize, it's something that is highly respected in the community. It adds to the joy of having made a significant discovery.
So nobody really, does anybody resonate briefly on what Professor Deaton said about some sad, damaged, tormented souls going around saying, oh, I should have won the Nobel, I could have won the Nobel, it's not fair. Has anybody come across any of such individuals?
I have comment more than why I should have won the Nobel. When you see a major breakthrough in your field, I personally feel very bad. I should have made that discovery. Not that I'm... Right now, there is something called CRISPR. It's very hot in our field. And I wish I had made that discovery myself. I would give anything for it. So it's not competition per se, but it is a scientist and individual's drive to discover an important thing. And
Thank you for your honesty, Professor Sanjot. All right, so now we're moving to a specific question, which is for you, Professor Angus Deaton. You're, of course, the economics laureate, and you won your prize for really shedding a great deal of light on the links between poverty, consumption, and welfare, and what implications there are for policymakers, particularly in setting levels of taxation, for instance. But let's see what comes up from our students. Andreas.
Hi, I have a short question. Is fighting inequality a realistic aim?
It's maybe a short question, but I'm not sure it has a short answer. I mean, here I think is the essence of the matter, which is we have tools to fight inequality. You know, you could have in the United States a much more progressive tax system, for instance. You know, we could spend more money on education and less on defense. I've heard Aziz talk about that. And there's lots of things you could do. So the question is not having the tools. So it's realistic in the sense that we have the tools, right? It's unrealistic in the sense that the politics is extraordinarily difficult. So, you know, the people who have all the money also have a lot of political power, and they're not very interested in fighting inequality. And so what do? If you think there's too much inequality or inequality has reached dangerous levels, which I do, then I think the best thing to do is you have to participate in the democratic process and persuade other people that it's a problem. For instance, by being on a TV show like this.
So it is can be done, you say, but it's a lack of political will. The tools are there. You mentioned taxation sort of in passing, but just briefly outline for us then, what are the tools that can be used to reduce inequality?
Well, there's a lot of tax tools. I mean, one of them, for instance, is like an inheritance tax, for example. So many of us have always thought that fairly stiff inheritance taxes were a good thing because it stops you having this hereditary inequality, what Thomas Piketty famously has called patrimonial capitalism.
He's the French economist who's written a lot about inequality.
That's right. And I think many of us think it's good for each generation, each group of kids who are born each generation, to have an equal chance, not just depending on what their parents have. And two ways of doing that. One is, inheritance taxes. Another is trying to equalize the opportunities at schools. And there's a big concern in the United States now that, the best schools are going to the kids of the well-off people. And it's very hard, much harder than it was in our generation, for kids from poor families to get a really first-class education. And that's absolutely vital.
Professor Aziz Sancar, would you mind my bringing you in just on this particular point? Yes. Because I hope you don't mind me saying that you were born in Turkey.
That's
and
right.
You're one of 8 children.
Right.
And your parents could not read or write.
Right.
And here you are, a Nobel laureate, completely exemplifying what Professor Deaton said.
So the United States has 25% of total prisoner population. And that has to do with inequality. It has to do with lack of opportunity. And that is a problem. I think there was a recent article in New England Journal of Medicine comparing the healthcare system in Turkey and in the United States. It's much better in Turkey. Turkey does not have the resources of the United States. And here we passed Obamacare, which is a universal healthcare system, and we're still fighting it. A group in the United States still fighting it. So even though I come from a country where the resources and so on are not as advanced as the United States, I think in certain aspect, in terms of equal opportunity for education in Turkey is free. You don't have that in the United States.
But it was just your own individual personal story illustrates that if you're given that equality of opportunity, somebody of your background can rise to the top.
Can do it. And I wish my adopted country would take the necessary steps to do that.
All right. Okay, thank you. There is another question for you, Professor Deaton, and that's from David Gandolfi. David?
Thank you, Professor Deaton, for coming here, and thank to all the Nobel laureates. My question is specifically, you have expressed some criticism about foreign aid to poor countries. Now, why is that?
Okay. So let me start by saying that I'm not critical at all of the wish to help people in poor countries. But I think a lot of what we're doing in terms of foreign aid right now is actually not helping at all. And there's lots of things we can do from the outside which will make the new innovations, the new discoveries, and so on, which will help poor countries. I think countries that have very large aid inflows into the domestic economy, that tends to undermine the sort of responsible government that you need in order for development to have any chance of taking place. I think the sort of aid, I think a bill here is my example of exactly the sort of aid that really works, which is we can spend money in the United States, in Sweden, and so on, to get the sort of discoveries that save millions of lives or save people from being blind. That's a sort of aid. So I'm not a blanket against aid, but if we can help spend money, I mean, Merck made that drug available through the World Bank to many people around the world.
We'll come to that in a moment.
And you know, that's a huge gift from rich countries to poor countries. So if we're doing that sort of aid,
so you're saying don't give it to dodgy rulers in Africa because you can't trust them for what they'll do with it.
Or we're creating dodgy rulers by, you know, basically saying you don't have to raise anything from your own population. We'll keep you in business by giving you enormous sums of money. So, you know, we're making the dodgy rulers even dodgier. And that's the one of the central problems.
He's opened up a whole can of worms there, Phil Campbell. I know you like worms. We're going to come to that later. Now, Svetlana Alexeyevich, we come to you. You are from Belarus, you're Belarusian, and you won the Literature Prize for your whole body of work that you've written over many, many decades, giving voice to the voiceless. You've written things like Voices of Chernobyl, about the ghastly nuclear accident in 1986. You've written Zinky Boys, about the Soviet-Afghan war, when there were young Russian soldiers coming back in zinc coffins, hence Zinky Boys. Talked about women suffering in the Second World War, and that has led to a genre that you describe as a documentary novel. And the citation said that you have the soul of a historian, and in many ways you write your works are based on the testimony of real people. So that's just by way of background of your work, but let's see what the question is for you. And I think that, Diana, you have a question, Diana? Yeah, for Svetlana.
So do you believe your message gets out there in a better way by using journalistic methods rather than fictional ones?
Дело в том, что то, что я занимаюсь, я не могу сказать, что это журналистика. Это не журналистика, это литература. Просто мы живем в такое время, когда темпы жизни совершенно другие, скорость другая. События наслаиваются одно на другое. Мы вот возьмем последние 2 года, сколько всего произошло. И это невозможно, нет времени, чтобы действительно это все изучить, как там Толстой имел 50 лет для того, чтобы написать о войне свой главный труд «Война и мир». Этого времени сегодня у писателя нету. Но я занимаюсь не историей, я занимаюсь историей души. И поэтому и занимаюсь пропущенной историей. То, что история обычно пропускает. Она высокомерна к тому, что думает человек. Ее это не интересует. Ее интересует, когда все это уже материализовалось в неких событиях, в неких каких-то фигурах. У меня просто взятие материала, находка материала, она журналистская. Я езжу, ищу людей и разговариваю с ними. А разговаривать это тоже надо. Я иначе разговариваю с людьми, не так, как журналист. Журналист берет у человека верхний слой. Я бы даже сказала банально информационный слой. Я же беру, как это в человеческой душой обживается, что там происходит.
But you have also, like a journalist, been very political and very outspoken in your criticisms, both of President Lukashenko of Belarus, and you're half Ukrainian, so you've also been very critical of President Putin and his actions in Ukraine, particularly over Crimea and so on. So I think a lot of people are very interested in what you have to say about the current political situation that is going on in the former Soviet Union. And I wonder if you would just briefly give us an idea of how you see things evolving in that part of the world.
Вы знаете, я человек русской культуры, то есть воспитана в русской культуре, а в русской культуре поэт всегда больше, чем поэт. Это классическая форма времен Пушкина, и она до сих пор осталась, потому что мы все время живем в той или иной степени авторитарных системах. И поэтому зашиться где-то в уголок и делать вид, что ты выше всего этого, это с точки зрения русской культуры непозволительно для русского писателя. Вот я сама по себе совершенно не баррикадный человек. И я бы тоже люблю одинокий труд и постигать вот человеческую природу. Да? Это достаточно интересно. Вот. Но, к сожалению, жизнь совершенно другая. Что касается того, что происходит сегодня вот у нас, происходит очень печально. Вот мое поколение, то, кто делало перестройку, мы живем, конечно, с чувством поражения. Мы потерпели поражение, и я бы сказала, что мы не использовали свой шанс 90-х годов. Вот тот шанс, когда все мы открыто верили, что старый мир позади, и здесь вы, и мы там у себя, и что мы будем жить в каком-то безопасном, во всяком случае, мире. Вот. Это оказалось совершенно не так, потому что свободу нельзя завести как швейцарский шоколад или там финскую бумагу, или Бентли, или какую-то еще новую модель машины. Свобода – это очень сложное состояние. Это накопление, это должно много времени пройти для того, чтобы это мы только сейчас обнаружили, только сейчас поняли. Нам же казалось, что это будет сразу.
Thank you. We have another question for Svetlana from Jamie.
Right now, the world is faced with huge challenges such as climate change, ongoing conflicts, and waves of refugees who flee in their countries. With this in mind, what makes you optimistic about the future of mankind, humanity?
So, Svetlana Alexievich, that's a question for you. Briefly, if you would be so kind as to answer that question, because I have to say, you have been described as a writer of catastrophes.
Вы знаете, я никогда не согласна, что я писатель катастроф, потому что мне все время кажется, что я пишу о любви. Да? То есть я ищу, как вот это, не коллекционирую ужас, я коллекционирую человеческий дух. Как сторожить в себе человека, как сохранить в себе человека. Вот это меня интересует. И я думаю, во всяком случае, я надеюсь, что у человечества нет других вариантов. Все-таки мы люди, мы должны, в общем-то, найти выход достаточно из трудного времени, в котором оказались. Но если внимательно почитать любую историческую книгу, то можно сказать, что люди всегда жаловались на свои времена.
Thank you very much indeed, Svetlana. Thank you. So I think now we move to a specific question for the Professor William Campbell, one of the 3 medicine and physiology laureates, but your 2 colleagues are not with us. Yu Tu from China, who was awarded the prize for discovering a very effective malaria treatment, artemisinin, derived from natural plants. And interestingly enough, she actually went and referred to a Chinese book on medicine, Chinese medicine, which is 1,700 years old. But you were also awarded the prize, Professor Campbell, with Professor Omura from Japan, and he sent you some soil. Well, he sent the institute that you're working at some soil samples, and from that you managed to derive treatment for terrible tropical diseases, elephantiasis, where the limbs really swell, and river blindness, which is a terrible affliction that has ruined lives, millions of lives. So that's what you won the prize for. But let's hear what the question is from Jeremy Forsberg. Jeremy, thank you.
Professor Campbell, where do you think that the next generation of antibiotics will come from? Are they coming primarily from the nature itself?
Yes, I think they are most likely to come from nature. And I think we have approached this naively in the past. We sometimes get caught up with very sophisticated modern technology and its possibilities of finding new drugs. It's odd and reassuring to me that all 3 of us involved in this particular prize worked with plants or products of nature. And I recently made a proposal, harking back to what I've been making for almost 40 years. But my proposal now is to have a much greater scouring of the world for novel microorganisms or animals or plants that may provide the next leads. And there are talents out there that I think could be brought to bear You know, if countries can put men outside of the Earth and bring them back to Earth, one would think they could solve some of these problems.
But when you were working on what led to ivermectin, and you talked about how you went to Togo in Africa, and it was really uplifting for you to see the children being treated from this terrible illness, which their parents and grandparents, you know, literally rendered blind. Was that a motivating factor for you, this sort of compassion? Was that part of the
It was not a motivation for me. It was inspirational to me. It was uplifting for me. It was a fabulous thing for me. But most researchers, even in medical fields, setting aside certain idealistic physicians, but most researchers in the medical field are interested in the research, and they are interested in doing research that might turn out to be good. But their motivation is basically their curiosity, the scientific challenge, certainly with that thought that it'd be great if this is useful.
But not compassion.
It's not done for reasons of compassion. Right. And I think that's a frequent misunderstanding. But also, by way of perspective, let me say this, that when I was employed by the Merck Pharmaceutical Company many years ago, I was employed specifically and solely to try and find a new drug for schistosomiasis, a tropical disease sometimes called snail fever. And
which is bilharzia.
Which is bilharzia, or bilharziolisis. And I worked on that solely, focused on that for 7 years. I had an unblemished record of failure, and I had a wonderful time doing it. I was not the slightest bit discouraged. I intended to spend the rest of my life doing it, but I got diverted into a lot of other things, and that project was carried on by other people in my department for many, many years. I was never asked to stop doing it. I never ceased to be funded for doing it. And I think there are lots of discussion we should have about that.
Anybody pick up, although despite this breakthrough of treating these terrible diseases, compassion was not necessarily the motivating factor. Yeah, Professor Lindahl.
We work on cancer research, so people ask all the time, are you finding any new drugs for cancer research? When can we cure cancer? And I hope that will be an important consequence of what we are doing. But as I see it, it's still a side effect of what we are doing. What we are really trying to do is understand the world we are living in, how our cells function. Once we know that, we can develop new drugs and all kinds of other nice things.
I have follow-up.
Yeah.
I have not been this jealous of Nobel Prize in medicine in my entire life. I really admire. When I heard it, I said, this is the way to give Nobel.
For somebody... Yeah.
I had a lab meeting that morning. I went and we usually discuss our experiments, and I just didn't discuss the experiment. I discussed Nobel in medicine, and I discussed heroes, and these guys are my heroes.
Yeah, absolutely, what they did. Can I say, though, Professor Sanjay, as somebody who's an expert in DNA and maybe genes and that kind of thing, you might try and isolate the envy gene and use yourself in the laboratory. Talk twice about envy now. So... Well, since the chemists and Nobel laureates have come in here, chemistry Nobel laureates, let's go to our specific question on your work on repairing damaged DNA. Emma Eriksson, you have a question.
Do you think that the future strategy of curing cancer will be to repair the reparation systems of DNA, or will the changes in behavior be more important?
So should people change their behavior? Paul Modrich, Professor Modrich, yeah.
Certain behaviors directly cause cancer. Smoking is one.
Alcohol?
Well, I'm not going to... My personal
You're clearly a man who enjoys a tipple.
I drink alcohol, but my personal belief is that alcohol itself is not known to be a carcinogen, but one of its metabolic products is. And I think it's quite clear that it's probable, in my view, that certain food products may have cancer-causing.
You say some food products, because there have been lots of headlines
I
you see
will
about
not.
cured
Yeah, I mean,
processed meat
many
being
of them have been addressed in the popular media, and I think the evidence is incomplete. And but I think the evidence will be forthcoming, and this, I think, will probably go a long way to reducing or potentially reducing the incidence of cancer in the human population.
Oh, so you think the evidence will come? Because we have had these headlines about the British breakfast, the English breakfast, the fried bacon and sausages
50 years
give you
ago,
cancer.
it was debatable whether smoking.
The bangers you're saying here.
50 years ago, it was debatable whether cigarettes cause cancer, and it's quite clear. Now, I mean, it's completely unequivocal. And,
so you drink alcohol, though, sometimes. Do you eat cured, processed meat and cook it?
Do.
You do? Well, if it's good enough for you, Professor Modric?
Right, well, that's, do as I say, not as I do.
Professor Aziz Sanjar, because your particular work focused very much on sun exposure to sun and UVA damage, ultraviolet damage and so on. People still sunbathe, don't they? And they know
that's one of the unambiguous case of the environment being a carcinogen. There is no doubt that sun exposure, ultraviolet, causes skin cancer, and yet people do sunbathe, and how you change people's behavior, I don't know how to do it.
We'll move on to our physics laureates now, Takaaki Kajita and Arthur MacDonald, because you won your prize for neutrinos, telling us that neutrinos, which are this subatomic particle, which is ubiquitous in our universe, it used to be thought that it had no mass. You've discovered that it does have some mass, and I understand that there are billions of these things passing through our body and so on and so forth. And in some way, it will help us understand how the universe works better. But anyway, that's a very brief summary of your what you won the prize for. But let's get our question from Elizabeth. Elizabeth Liljeblad, your question, please, to the physics laureates.
Do you think that mankind will benefit in the future from researches in fields beyond applied physics, such as astroparticle physics, in more ways than by increasing our general knowledge of the universe?
Professor MacDonald?
The greater degree to which you can understand the details of the laws of physics, the better you are to apply such things. I'll give you an example even from such esoteric and difficult to detect particles as neutrinos. I mean, neutrinos are outside the general experience of humans. Maybe once in your lifetime, a neutrino will stop in your body and change one atom into something else, and you won't even notice it. But that's really the only influence that you have, and yet there are something like 6 billion neutrinos going through your fingernail per second from the sun. We use those neutrinos from the sun to understand the fusion processes that are taking place that power the sun with great accuracy. In fact, the puzzle that we solved, that neutrinos do change from one type to another, which implies that they have mass, was able to sort out what could have been a problem with the calculations of how many neutrinos are produced, and therefore the understanding of the basic fusion power of the sun confined by gravity. It's now been determined that these calculations are accurate to much better than 10%. Those are the same types of calculations that are being applied to try to harness fusion power here on Earth, confined by magnetic fields. And so it's a prime example of how knowing the pure physics as accurately as you can enables you then to apply those laws of physics in trying to move forward with applied physics.
Professor Kajita, I mean, it's interesting that Professor Art MacDonald there talks about how I think it's one of the 3 types of neutrinos is from the sun, and mentioning this idea of nuclear fusion is what I wanted to ask you about, because a lot of people are looking at that now as a source of energy for us. I mean, is this something which your discovery that neutrinos have mass could perhaps help us harness nuclear fusion from the sun better?
Let me mention the application of pure physics into the applied science. Another example, not neutrino physics. Okay? Well, this year is the 100 years of general relativity. People thought this is really a pure science, no application to daily life. However, after 100 years, we cannot live without the knowledge of general relativity because our GPS is based on general relativity. Now, we use GPS. But if we have no idea about general relativity, the GPS doesn't work. So general relativity, which was thought to be pure theoretical, pure basic science, is relevant to our daily life after 100 years. So maybe neutrinos could also be relevant.
You know, I'm just going to bring in Randy Nordstrom. I think you've got a question which is very related to the answer you've just already given, Professor Kajuta.
I'm wondering if you think that the focus of academia should be on fundamental research, so to find out how the world really works, or if we should focus more on application and product development.
Mm-hmm. Who'd like to pick up on that? I mean, Professor Kajuta's already kind of addressed
Can
that.
I comment on that?
Professor
So
Aldrich.
I think history has clearly shown us time after time of the power of knowledge. And knowledge comes from basic science or basic research in other fields. And I mean, it's hard to develop new things if you do not understand how the world works. And that's really the goal of basic science, and I think that's its intrinsic value. I would argue that every major modern medical advance is directly tied to advances in basic science.
Svetlana Alexievich, I wanted to ask you, because obviously you're not a scientist, but your writing is very much based on knowledge and research, which you get from the people you talk to who bear witness to the upheavals in the events that you have drawn on for your writing. So really it's picking up Professor Modrich's point that you need to anchor what you do on research, in your case, talking to people.
Я хочу сказать, что я безумно всем вам завидую. У меня такое ощущение, что я сижу среди земных богов. И вот когда я прихожу к человеку, я хочу выяснить, ну как он хочет жить, что ему мешает, то ли культура, то ли ментальность, то ли вообще какие-то рациональные вещи. То есть от человека к человеку я иду и хочу собрать вот этот образ времени, правду времени, чтобы, ну, в принципе, если это реально для искусства, помочь человеку. Ну, конечно, когда вы говорите языком будущим, о будущем, какое дело до вас, власти, да? Или вы живете в другом времени. Вы живете в тех проблемах, ну, а когда я приезжаю, я говорю о войне в Донбассе, говорю о Чернобыле. Конечно, вы сразу становитесь проблемой для власти.
Thank you. Professor Deaton, you wanted to come in?
I just wanted to come back a little bit to compassion and curiosity and, you know, fun. So I think we all do this. I mean, everything I've heard about, you know, when you're actually doing the work, you're motivated by curiosity, by trying to resolve puzzles, by trying to resolve paradoxes and so on. I also remember Aziz at a previous meeting saying that one of the greatest moments in his life is when he's in a laboratory and he sees something and he thinks, only God and I, for the moment, understand this process. And I mean, in my way, I can think of things like that too. There's a moment when I suddenly understand something and everything fits into place. And, you know, I just know a whole bunch, you know, there's light suddenly where there was darkness and mist before. And that's a wonderful feeling. But, so we don't do it for compassion. We do it for that feeling, that aha moment, that discovery. But, you know, it's all within a social context in which there are funding agencies out there. There's society who's deciding which fields are really important to work on. There's people responding in economics. Whenever there's a, you know, in the Great Depression, that was what caused some of the greatest future Nobel laureates and other people to move into economics, because they wanted to help people. So it was the compassion that drove people into economics. It's funding agencies, it's poverty in the world. And for me, it's always been, that's for me has been very direct.
Lovely.
I may make a point. As a scientist, I usually think that what I say no one outside scientists pay any attention to, and I'm really gratified and very happy that Dr. Deaton has quoted me twice today.
Absolutely. But I should say that actually, interesting enough, you, Aziz Sancar, are an MD, a medical doctor, as you are too, Thomas Lindahl, but you only lasted 1 year as a doctor and you only 2 years as a doctor.
Right. Yes.
So you didn't have the compassion gene to carry on helping. Really. Professor Lindahl, briefly.
Well, I would like to go back to Svetlana's comment that we live in a privileged society. We can pursue our ideas without being regarded with suspicion by the government. I'm old enough to have had colleagues and done some work in Eastern Germany, well, a bit over 35 years ago. And it was obvious that the local scientists, they immediately became my friends, though I never met them before, because we had a common enemy. And there were people in gray suits who were sitting in the room trying to figure out if we were doing something subversive. In their mind, scientists were the same thing as terrorists. And that was an uneasy feeling. And I think that has largely disappeared now.
Mm-hmm. OK, so we've got a couple of questions now. If I can go to Annelie Borg first, and then Rabia Ayoub, if you could both give us your point. Annelie.
Yeah, so my question is whether you would encourage a young person or student to become a scientist in your own field.
OK, thank you. Rabia Ayoub.
What skills do you think were most important on your way to success?
OK, thank you. Who would like to pick up on Annelie Borg? Would you encourage a young person or student to become a scientist in your field? Professor Lindahl, I have to say, let me ask you, because I know that you had a teacher, a chemistry teacher, who you didn't really get on with and who failed you, in fact, and yet here you are, a chemistry laureate. How about that?
It means that there are some teachers that are very bad teachers. But you should be stubborn in science. You shouldn't be easily discouraged. Occasionally you meet scientists who have some idea that's obviously wrong, and they just spend years and years pursuing that idea. But that's exceptional. I think it's much more common that scientists give up too easily. You have an unusual observation, and nature is telling you something here. You're privileged. You have new information. And you shouldn't just put it in a drawer because you don't understand it.
Professor Deaton, you actually didn't start off with wanting to become an economist, did you? You actually went into university to study mathematics.
And then gave up on it, or it gave up on me. I would say one thing, though, and some of you are not going to like this, but, you know, the mathematics I learned early on has been incredibly useful to me, even though I'm not a mathematician. And there's a very wide range of sciences and economics and other things where mathematics is really important. So, you know, push yourself as far as you can in that direction. There's obviously areas where it's more important than others, but it's often extremely important, and it helps you think very clearly as part of it.
Aziz Sancar?
We all talk about how this or that teacher made a big difference in our lives, and because they're not paid well, they're not respected in society. Our best minds do not go into teaching. And I just hope that through this medium, both young scientists and young people and their parents encourage their children, the capable, intelligent children, to become teachers.
And one thing I'd like to say, and use you as an example, perhaps, Professor Bill Campbell, is that don't be scared of the contradictions, perhaps, within you, because I know that you have a huge love, admiration, and respect for parasites and worms. And yet, ironically, you've spent your life researching how to kill them.
Right.
So there's this ambivalence here. But I know in your spare time you like to paint them. You paint worms. And when you met President Barack Obama, he gave you a stuffed animal in the form of a worm.
Right.
It's pride of place in your home. And you also write poems about worms. So I'm hoping that you might be able to give us a rendition.
In my poems, I sometimes like to speak on behalf of the worms and give them a chance to say something. And I do happen to have one in particular, a case for a worm that causes river blindness, in fact. I can imagine it being very frustrated and getting more and more angry as people accuse it of causing blindness, when blindness, in fact, is a chance offshoot of their infection. The causative agent is migrating through the skin all over the body, and some of them are going to end up in the eye. And as humans, of course, we're very, very unhappy about that. But I imagine one of those worms saying this, and you have to remember that I think they're pretty frustrated. I don't need your goddamn eye. All I need is a piece of skin big enough to let me drop a few larvae in. Just enough to make sure that there will be a pickup and delivery. Don't look at me that way. I don't need your goddamn eye.
Professor Bill Campbell, and actually, thank you to all our laureates. Spasibo Balshoy, Svetlana Alexeyevich, and renewed congratulations to all of you. Thank you to our students who have given us questions, some encouraging, inspiring, and honest words from our Nobel laureates. From me, Zeinab Badawi, and all the team on Nobel Minds from the Concert Hall in Stockholm, Sweden. Goodbye, season's greetings, and a Happy New Year.